I'm happy that Dr. Lockshin is here to give his class this morning. We're all here. We should hear good news, and what can I say? We can. The Torah should be a schut to have bring peace to the Jewish people and the world at large. V'kasha, Dr. Lockshin.
Since there is not very much that we can do about the very sad situation here, the one thing that we can do is study Torah, as Rabbi Kelvin suggested, and so we will do that. When I woke up this morning, I had an email from Rabbi Kelvin who suggested what it was that I ought to be talking about today in this session. And he's right. That's what I should have planned to talk about, but I didn't. The issue of mimachorat Shabbat, on the day after Shabbat. So I said to him, you're right. That's what I should have planned for the session just before Shavuot, but I don't have time to do that. But I'll begin the session by showing you a couple of texts that deal with this subject. And then I had planned something else that is relevant for the holiday of Shavuot coming up next week. I was going to talk about the two versions of the Ten Commandments, the one in Exodus and the one in Deuteronomy. So we'll begin with Rabbi Kelman's topic, and then we'll move on to the topic that I had planned. Okay, let me share my screen.
Of course, it's all my fault that I should have mentioned it last week. So I told you can feel free to ignore me.
But you were right. It's a good idea. So as I'm sure many people know the problem here, but let us just review it, what it says in the Torah about the holiday of Shavuot coming up next week. So first of all, Leviticus chapter 23, they begin by discussing the rules of Passover, which I didn't write here. And then it says, after the section about Pesach, it says, Daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem ki tavu al arz asher ani noten lechem u'ktzartem et ketzirah v'havetem et omer reshit ketzirachem el hakohen. Speak to the Israelite people, say to them, when you enter the land that I'm giving to you and you reap the harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. And then I'm skipping a couple of verses.
Thank you very, very much.
There's if people could mute themselves.
I'll try to be on top of it as quickly as I can. But yes, everybody, please do mute yourself.
Thank you. Okay, then I skipped a couple of verses about what the priest is supposed to do, what the Kohen is supposed to do with this sheaf that is brought to him. Then it says, Usvartem lachem mimachorat haShabbat miyom aviachem et omer hatnufa sheva Shabbatot temimot tihena ad mimachorat haShabbat hashevi'it tisperu 50 yom v'hikravtem mincha chadasha l'Hashem. From the day on which you bring the sheaf of the elevation offering, this is the JPS translation, the day after the Sabbath, mimachorat HaShabbat, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete weeks. You must count until the day after. So the Hebrew again says here, Ad mimachorat HaShabbat HaShevi'it, which they translate here, even though they translated the first Shabbat as Sabbath, they translate the second Shabbat as you must count until the day after the 7th week. They translate that Shabbat as week, which I can understand why they might have varied that. 50 days. And then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. And then there's a description of the celebration of the holiday of Shavuot. And the next verse says specifically that this is the holiday of Shavuot that is on the 50th day after this ceremony of bringing the first sheaf of grain. And that first sheaf of grain is brought on the day after the Shabbat, on Mimachorat Shabbat. And I assume that pretty well everybody here knows that there was a big dispute in Talmudic times between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and later on in medieval times and even into modern times between the Rabbinites and the Karaites. with the Sadducees saying that Shabbat means Shabbat. That when it says you shall count from the day after Shabbat, it means that you start counting on Sunday. And then when you get to the 50th day, the 50th day is, of course, always a Sunday. If you start counting on Sunday, then the 50th day, if the first day is Sunday, then 49 days later, the 50th day will be Sunday. And the standard rabbinic understanding of the text is that Shabbat means the first day of Passover, that the day on which you bring this sheaf offering. And so it's not totally wild, the rabbinic interpretation. I didn't bring you any texts here that try to take you through the text of Leviticus 23 step by step and argue that it is reasonable to interpret the word Shabbat here as meaning the first day of Passover, but I'll just try to summarize some of the arguments that you do find on the subject. There's no mention of any Saturday anywhere in this text. So saying that Mimachorat Shabbat obviously means Sunday. What Shabbat are we talking about? Which Sunday are we talking about? We were referring before to the holiday of Passover and to the days of Passover on which work isn't done, and those are days of Shabbat in a sense. They're days of refrain from work, and so there is an argument that has been put together to try to defend the Pharisaic and the Rabbinite position. As I said, the Sadducees back in 2,000 years ago said that Shavuot always is celebrated on Sunday. And the Karaites, beginning in medieval times, also said that Shavuot is always celebrated on Sunday. Does anybody here know? Does anybody want to unmute themselves and say when the Karaites are celebrating Shavuot this year? The Rabbinite Jews will be celebrating Shavuot on Monday. And when are the Karaites? Anybody know when the Karaites are celebrating Shavuot this year? No volunteers? Well, I'll just tell you, they're celebrating
a week later.
Yeah, very good. 6 days later. Thank you very much. I didn't want to put anybody on the spot and say, are there any Karaites here in the crowd? But they said, the Karaites and presumably the Sadducees, we don't have any text left from the Sadducees, but the difficulty, even if you say that Shabbat means Shabbat here in this text, the day after Shabbat means Sunday. Well, you have to figure out which Shabbat it's being talked about. So the Karaites say that the Shabbat here is obviously the first Shabbat after the dates that were mentioned in the previous section about Passover. So they talk about Passover, and then there's a Shabbat in Passover. And this year, since Passover began on Sunday, then Shabbat was for those of us here in Israel, it was the last day of Passover. For those of you outside of Israel, it was the second last day of Passover, and so that's the Shabbat of Pesach, the Shabbat of Passover, and so that's when you start counting. So that's the first text in the Bible that talks about establishing the date of Shavuot. The second text that talks about establishing the date of Shavuot is in Deuteronomy. Shiva Shavuot tispor lach, mehachel chermesh bakama, tachel lispor Shiva Shavuot, ve'asita chag Shavuot l'Hashem Elokecha. You shall count off 7 weeks. And where do you start? You start to count the 7 weeks when the sickle is first put to the standing grain, of the first day of trying to harvest the grain. Then after the 7 weeks after that first day of harvest. You shall observe the Feast of Weeks. You shall observe Shavuot for the Lord. And you can see this text actually, it blends in nicely with what it says there in Leviticus. It also talks about that you reap its harvest, and then you bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. And then it says, and from that day you count you count the 7 days, so 7 weeks. So those are the 2 formulations in the Torah of figuring out when Shavuot is. The text that I wanted to look at with you here is an interesting text written by Rabbi Judah Halevi and the Kusari. I'm sure all or almost all of you know that the Kusari is a book of dialogue about the the kingdom of the Khazars, who was investigating religions and invites a Muslim and a Christian to explain Islam and Christianity to him, and invites a philosopher to explain philosophy to him. And then he decides, even though he thought that the Jews were this downtrodden people who probably didn't have anything to say, he decided to invite a Jewish spokesman, and he invites the Chaver, as Judah Levi calls him, the rabbi, the scholar of Judaism, to come and explain to him the essence of Judaism. And in the middle of this dialogue, he converts to Judaism. And historically, we know that many of the Khazars at some point in medieval times converted to Judaism. Rabbi Judah Halevi makes it very clear in his introduction to the work that he didn't have a tape recorder there that was recording the conversations that took place between the spokesman for Judaism and the Khazar king, that he made up the dialogue, and he explained he explained what he thinks is a good argument for Judaism. So we're in the third part of this dialogue. Paragraph 40, the Khazar king says, this text was written in Judeo-Arabic. That's why we don't have the original here, because I could assume that there are very few of us who can read the original Judeo-Arabic, so there's no real reason to read it in Hebrew. English is as good as Hebrew for this purpose. So the Khazar king said, how could the fact that rabbis add things to what it says in the Torah, be made to agree with the verse, you shall not add to it nor diminish from it? So the book of Deuteronomy says, lo tosef alo v'lo tigru mimenu. You're not allowed to add or diminish from the Torah. So here's what the Khazar, what the spokesman for Judaism answers. This was only said to the masses, that they should not conjecture and theorize and contrive laws according to their own conception, as the Karaites do. So individuals are not allowed to add or subtract from the law. But with regard to the priests and judges, it is said that their decisions are binding. But it does say, and he quotes a couple of passages in the Torah that say that when you have a dispute, you take it to the judges who are in the place that God has chosen. You put the dispute before them, and they render judgment about this dispute. For they have divine assistance, because God is on their side. God will make sure that they give the right answer, and would never, on account of their large number, concur in anything which contradicts the law. One individual can make a mistake, but since there's a group of scholars who are gathered in Jerusalem at the place that God has chosen, and they are interpreting the law, then their interpretation is authoritative. Much less likelihood was there of erroneous views, because they had inherited vast learning. They also were extremely learned, and so to go to authority figures is not the same as going to just anybody, Joe down the hall, to make a decision for you about a halachic issue. And then he gives an example. He just comes up with the example of the day after Shabbat. He says, now, suppose we allow the Karaite interpretation of the verse from the morrow of the Sabbath till the morrow of the Sabbath to refer to Sunday. He's being careful in his argument. He's not coming right out and saying, I think that the Karaites actually have it right here. What is the simple meaning of the text? But he says, let's just suppose that that's the case. Then he says, but we reply, okay, so the Karaites come to us and say, that's what the text says, the day after the Sabbath, so it has to be Sunday. How do we answer the Karaites? We reply that one of the judges, priests, or pious kings, in agreement with the Sanhedrin and all the sages, found that this period was fixed with the intention of creating an interval of 50 days between the first fruits of the harvest of barley and the harvest of the wheat, and to observe 7 weeks, which are 7 complete Sabbaths. So the sages looked at the Torah and they said, well, the purpose here is to have 50 days between the beginning of the harvest of barley and the beginning of the harvest of the wheat, and to have 7 complete weeks. The first day of the week is only mentioned for argument's sake. Again, he's not coming right out and saying that this is the interpretation, but we could argue this. The first day of the week is only mentioned for argument's sake in the following manner. Should the day of putting the sickle to the corn be a Sunday, then count till Sunday. From this, we conclude that should the beginning be on a Monday, then we count till Monday, as would be what happens this year, that since the first day of Passover was on Sunday, so the day of the cutting of if there was still the ceremony of cutting of the Omer, it would have been done on Monday, 6 weeks ago, and that's why Shavuot is on Monday. The date of putting the sickle from which we count is left for us to fix. You know, he might be arguing that the way that the text phrases it here in Devarim and Deuteronomy makes it clear that you're not beginning on a specific date, that just the starting point, the terminus from which you start, is from the day when the sickle is first put to the grain. And so because of that, they understood that this was the purpose. And I'm like 5-6 lines from the end of the text. The date of putting the sickle from which we count is left for us to fix. This was fixed for the second day of Passover, which does not contradict the Torah. It's not a contradiction of the Torah, since it's originated with the place which the Lord shall choose on the conditions discussed before. This was the interpretation that was passed down by the people who, by the members of the court in Jerusalem, who are rendering the correct decisions for the Jewish people about how they are going to celebrate. It originated in the place which the Lord shall choose. Perhaps this was done under the influence of divine inspiration. And again, he's like pulling out every possible argument that you know, maybe God inspired them to do this. And I admit it's possible that the interpretation of the Karaites is the better interpretation, but the interpretation of the simplest, the interpretation of the Karaites might be the simplest interpretation of the text, but the authority figures in Jerusalem came up with this plan, and it doesn't actually contradict the Torah because it doesn't say precisely what that Shabbat is. So this is the way that Judah Halevi attempts to defend the fact that Shavuot is going to be celebrated on Monday next week by Jews who are not Karaites. This is, as Rabbi Kelman knew when he suggested this might be a good thing to talk about. This is, an excellent example of the possible tension between the plain meaning of the biblical text and the way that Halacha has determined Jewish law. And we see Rabbi Judah Halevi trying to finesse the tension here. And it seems to me that the simplest understanding of what he's doing here is saying that when the rabbis say that Shavuot is going to be on Monday this year, that's a result of, I'd reformulate what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says here in stronger language and say that it's a result of some legislation that the rabbis got together and said, we need a plan, we need some way of regularizing this, and the way of regularizing it is to say that it's always on the second day of Passover, not saying that it's on the Shabbat of Passover. In the 19th century, Shadal, Samuel David Luzzatto in Italy, likes the answer that's given by Rabbi Judah Halevi. I'll just read this in English. Maybe I'll just give credit where credit is due. I just received a copy of this new book, Shadal on Leviticus, a translation of of Shadal's commentary on Leviticus into English by Daniel Klein. I think it's a very good translation with some very helpful notes, and so here's his translation. The author of the Kuzari says that it should likely be conceded to the Karaites that Mimachorata Shabbat refers to the Sabbath of creation, in other words, the seventh day of the week, but that some of the judges in the Sanhedrin thought that the Torah mentioned the Sabbath only by way of an example, and that people have the authority to begin putting the sickle to the crops on any day that it wished. Thus, the judges and the Sanhedrin, established that the beginning of the harvest should be on the second day of Passover. So here's Shadal's summary of the Kuzari's position, and then he goes on. He knows that there were many people who tried to find ways of interpreting the text to say that the required interpretation, if you just look at the text and let the text speak to you, is that it's the second day of Passover. And one of the people who tried to do that was Abraham ibn Ezra, who was a relative, perhaps son-in-law of Rabbi Judah Halevi. There's dispute among scholars that there was some relationship between them, and it's possible that Ibn Ezra was married to Rabbi Judah Halevi's daughter, and Ibn Ezra quotes Judah Halevi a number of times. And here on this passage, I didn't give you the text here. It's a complicated passage where Ibn Ezra is really trying to prove that the rabbinic interpretation of the text is the correct interpretation of the text. And then Luzzatto says, know that all the lengthy verbiage of Ibn Ezra on this verse, I should tell you, Shadal did not like Ibn Ezra very much. Know that all the lengthy verbiage of Ibn Ezra on this verse is nothing but sleight of hand, and that the unstated main point of his reasoning is in accordance with the view of the author of the Kuzari, that the Sabbath mentioned here is the actual Sabbath, but the Torah mentioned the Sabbath day merely by way of example, and that we have the authority to present the Omer on the day that we wish. And so a couple of great rabbis, one in the 12th century and Shadal in the 19th century, are saying that it's hard to formulate an exegetical and interpretive argument for the halacha, but the halacha was based on a legislative decision that the Kuzari said this doesn't really contradict what it says in the Torah, but it isn't precisely what it says in the Torah, and that it's reasonable for the authorities to do something like this. Okay, So this is what I put together in a few hours since Rabbi Kelman asked me if I'd say something about this issue today. So maybe we'll just stop for a second and take a look at the chat before I go on to the next topic. Epi says, interesting, that Shavuot, where its date is not clearly given, the rabbis found it easy to fix the date at Sivan 6, but Purim, where the date is clearly given in Esther, the rabbis allowed for all kinds of different dates in Masechet Megillah. That's right, that's very, very true. Jennifer, no, I'm sorry, somebody asked, how do you time the giving of the first sheaf to the Sabbath, day after the Sabbath, which then kicks into motion the determination of when Shavuot will occur. So the idea, the rabbinic interpretation is that on the first day, on the first day of Passover, you won't do any work, but on the second day of Passover, sort of the intermediate days of Passover, it's called a moed. So then you're allowed to cut the grain for the celebration. Marianne writes, the Dead Sea Scrolls state that you count from the first Shabbat after Shavi'i Shel Pesach. This interpretation places Parshat Omer in proper chronological order. Marianne, I did not know that, but I think that makes an awful lot of sense. The first Shabbat after the seventh day of Passover. If you're just looking at 23 at chapter 23, so, and that's not what the Karaites do today. Yes, this is only said to the masses today. This strikes me as very insulting. Yes, a better job at educating than taking dangerous shortcuts. I will agree with that. It also says that you count until the day after the completion of 7 weeks. You count 50 days, correct? So you count. It's true, you count 49 days, but then it says, but then the day after the 49th day is the day that you celebrate. So two people asking the two sides of the same question, which is, are we counting 49 days or are we counting 50 days? And in a sense, it says that you shall count. Just look at the text again. The first formulation says, you shall count off 7 weeks, that's 49 days. And then it says, you count until the day after the seventh week, and then you make a holiday on that day. And so that's why the a number of rabbis tried to deal with this problem, the tension between the Midrash and the Pshat and the Halacha. Okay. And now to the topic that I wanted to deal with today, that we will start today and we will finish next week. The commandment about Shabbat in the Decalogue reads, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho, the first verse of it. Remember the Sabbath day. Again, I use the JPS translation here. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's possible, but I think a more literal translation might be remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There's no vav there in the Hebrew. We'll get back to this. ששת ימים תעבוד ועשית כל מלאכתך, ביום השביעי שבת להשם אלוקיך, לא תעשה כל מלאכה, אתה וביתך וביתך, ועבדך ועמתך ועבדך, וגרך אשר בשעריך, כי 6 ימים עשה השם את השמיים ואת הארץ, את הים וכל אשר בם, וינח ביום השביעי, על כן ברך השם את יום השבת ויקדשהו. Shall work for 6 days, 7th day is a Shabbat to the Lord your God. Don't do any work. You, your son, daughter, male or female, slave, your cattle, the stranger who is within your settlements, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day, and that is why the Lord blessed the Shabbat day, and he hallowed it. We will eventually, probably not today, but we will eventually, next week, we will get to comparing this formulation with the formulation in Deuteronomy. But the first thing that I wanted to do was just try to figure out what Zachor means here. And actually, there's an extremely wide variety of interpretations that you can find in the classical literature about what Zachor means. We will start with Rashbam, who many of you know is one of my favorite commentators. I don't know whether I agree with him here, and he's as he often does, he's going off in a direction that nobody else goes in understanding what the word remember means. First of all, he makes a claim that at first glance looks extremely persuasive, although we'll talk about it. He says, the verb to remember always refers to something from the past. What do you remember? You remember things that already happened. For example, Zechor Yamot Olam, remember the days of old, when the Most High gave nations their homes. Also, when the Jews were leaving Egypt, it says, Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yitzatem mimitzrayim, which he interprets as actually meaning, remember, in the future, you're supposed to remember this day on which you, in the past, shall have gone free from Egypt. That's what it means. It doesn't, see, the other way of understanding it, of course, is commit this to memory. In Exodus 13, they're just about to leave Egypt. And so Zachor could mean commit this to memory, implant this in your brain so you be sure that you don't forget this in the future. So we'll talk about that possibility of understanding what Zachor means. Also, remember, never forget how you provoked the Lord your God in various places, including in Horeb. Also, and this is the hardest one, I really don't understand why Rashbam thinks this is a good example to prove his point. He quotes the verse, Zechor rachamecha Hashem b'chasadecha ki me'olam hema. O Lord, be mindful of, remember your compassion and your faithfulness. They are as old as time. Unless Rashbam understands this to mean, remember, God, that what you've been doing all along is being compassionate to us, and you should continue doing what it is that you've been doing in the past. That could be how he's understanding this. Also, here also the verse means, remember that Sabbath day. When it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath day. What does that mean? Remember that Sabbath day that followed the 6 days of creation. The text then continues and explains how you should remember the Sabbath, as it is written below. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and that is why the text says here, remember the Sabbath day in order to keep it holy by refraining from work. So, Rashbam says that the commandment means remember creation. Remember the story of creation, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, and then as you continue in the commandment, it says, and now we're going to remind you about what happened in creation. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth and all those things. That's what you're supposed to remember. He rested on the 7th day. So when the commandment here says remember the Sabbath day, what it actually means is remember what you have learned about history, what you have learned about the fact that God was the one who created the world in 6 days and who rested on the 7th day. All based on Rashbam's argument here, which will show up a little later in some other texts we're going to be looking at, that remembrance means remembering something from the past. And just jumping around to a different category, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno in Italy in the beginning of the 16th century, who says the precise opposite. Always remember Shabbat during your weekday activities. And kind of like, remember what Amalek did to you. To keep it holy, do this and you will be able to keep it holy. How does this work? הזהיר שיסדר האדם מעשיו בדרך שיוכל להסיח דעתו מהם בשבת. The text instructs people to arrange their work in such a way that they will be able not to think about their work on Shabbat. Those of all of us who observe Shabbat know that this is extremely good advice. It's good to enter Shabbat without the worries of the work week, and the most effective way of doing that is to set up your work during the work week in such a way that you're going to be able to stop on Friday late afternoon from doing your work. So remember here means like the opposite of what Rashbam said. Rashbam said that remember means remember the past, and Sforno says keep in mind the future. When you are working, keep in mind that Shabbat is coming up. That's what it means to remember. And I said that at first glance, Rashbam's argument here that remembering always refers to something from the past, it seems a very logical claim, but we all know that we don't use the word remember that way. That, if we're sending off a child or a grandchild to go to a birthday party, we'll say something like, remember to say thank you to the birthday girl's mother at the end of the party. That doesn't mean remembering the past. It means keeping something in mind that you're going to be able to act on it, and that's how Sforno understands what it means to remember Shabbat. It means keeping it in mind, and then if you keep Shabbat in mind, you'll be able to observe Shabbat. This kind of approach goes way back. It's found in the Mechilta, which is a collection of Midrash Halacha on the book of Exodus. It says, Elazar ben Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Hananiah ben Garon says, remember the Sabbath day, remember it starting on Sunday, that if you find some choice portion, set it aside for Shabbat. That when you're in the marketplace and you see something nice, you see something good, something that you'd like to eat, then even though it's Sunday, you should say, I'm going to buy this and I am going to save it for Shabbat. So this is like the same idea as the Sforno says, though, that it's referring to refraining from work. It's good to set up your work during the work week in such a way that you'll be able to refrain from work when Shabbat comes along. And this opinion here in the Mechilta is saying, in order to make Shabbat special, you should be thinking about making Shabbat special. This has nothing to do with the restriction on work, but just on the desire to turn Shabbat into a special kind of day. The Rabbi Elazar ben Hananiah says that means when you find something special, you should set it aside for Shabbat. This same opinion that appears in the Mechilta appears later on in the Babylonian Talmud. They said about Shammai the elder that all his days he would eat in honor of Shabbat. If he found a choice animal, he would say, this is for Shabbat. If he subsequently found another one choicer than the first one, he would set aside the second for Shabbat, and he would eat the first one. So all week long, whenever he went shopping, whenever he was in the marketplace, he was always thinking about Shabbat, and he wanted to have the nicest things for Shabbat. Aval, but the Talmud continues, Aval Hillel Hazaken Mida Acheret Haita Lo, Shekol Ma'asav L'Shem Shamayim, Shene'emar, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. Hillel the elder, however, had a different trait. All his actions, including those on a weekday, were for the sake of heaven. As it is stated, blessed be the Lord day by day. So it's an interesting contrast. It said that everything that Shammai is doing is lichvod Shabbat, and everything that Hillel is doing is l'shem Shamayim, and it's that he's just trying to be a good person, a good Jew every day, and he's not organizing everything around the principle of saving everything for Shabbat. Surprisingly, Rashi in his commentary writes Zachor, Tanu lev liskor tamid et yom HaShabbat, she'im nizdamen lacha chefetz yafeh, tehei masmino l'Shabbat. Take care to remember always the Shabbat day, that if, for example, you come across a choice article of food during the week, put it aside for Shabbat. Why is this surprising? Because this is the opinion in the Talmud of Shammai and not the opinion of Hillel. And Halacha always follows the opinion of Hillel. And so commentators on Rashi spilled much ink trying to figure out why Rashi would give you this interpretation. Was there something, some of the commentators on Rashi, following the kind of approach that was made famous by Nechama Leibovich, are always looking for something textual. Is there something there in the text that caused Rashi to feel that this was the better interpretation of the words? And that's why he thinks that remembering, it means remembering it the way that Shammai thought that it should be remembered, by always being thinking of Shabbat every time you're going through the marketplace. Personally, I think that Rashi sometimes writes midrashim that he likes and that he thinks are very nice. And if you asked Rashi, is this the halacha, that you have to do this, that you have to be thinking about Shabbat every time you go to the market, he might, I'm guessing that he would say, no, this isn't the halacha. But he thinks it's a nice idea. That's I know that my approach to Rashi is not the standard one that that I was taught and that most of you were taught, but that's what I find the most meaningful way of understanding what Rashi is doing here. Ramban in his commentary writes, in explanation of the word Zachor, Rashi wrote, take care to remember always the Shabbat date, that if, for example, you come across a choice article of food during the week, put it aside for Shabbat. This teaching is found in the Mechilta, as we just saw, but it is recorded as the position of only one rabbi. It is not halacha. So Ramban is wondering, why is Rashi saying this? Or in case you think that because Rashi wrote it, that turns it into halacha, he wants to make sure that you realize that it is not halacha. And then he goes on. Those who interpret according to Pshat have said that it means that we should remember Shabbat all week long so that we will never forget it or get confused about when it falls. So that is the standard interpretation that Pshat commentators have given to the phrase in the Ten Commandments, remember the Sabbath day, means keep track of the days of the week. There are those who say that the reason that the morning service, the Shachrit service in synagogue, finishes every day with saying, today is the fourth day of the week, in which the Levites said the following prayer in the temple, is in order to be able to observe Shabbat. This is the way of keeping the mitzvah of remembering Shabbat, is keeping track of the days of the week. And we all know, all of us who have spent time around people who are elderly and going through some form of dementia, that confusion about the day of the week it's a big problem, and it's a way in which many people become kind of separated from reality. It's unclear whether all cultures, all through time, had this consciousness of the days of the week. This last Shabbat, I had a guest at a Shabbat meal who was a retired professor of Chinese history, and one of the other guests asked her whether people in China always had a consciousness of the days of the week. And if I understood her answer correctly, she said no, that it wasn't all that crucial, because there wasn't any in ancient China, there wasn't any weekend concept, and so there's no reason for anybody to have consciousness of the of the day of the week. But so a number of the Pshat commentators say that that is the mitzvah of remembering Shabbat. It's having this consciousness about the days of the week, and that's necessary. There are discussions in the Talmud. You find yourself on a desert island, and you've forgotten what day of the week it is. What do you do? How do you observe Shabbat when you've forgotten what the day of the week is, and there's no way of finding out what day of the week it is? But so there's this understanding of many commentators that that is the meaning of remembering Shabbat. It means remembering the days of the week. Ramban goes on another explanation in the Mechilta. Rabbi Yitzchak said, don't count the days of the week the way others do. Count in relation to Shabbat. The non-Jews had names for each of the days, either naming them as the Christians do after heavenly bodies, or using other names. But Jews count in relation to Shabbat. The first day of Shabbat, the second day of Shabbat. We do this because we were commanded to remember it every day. And this is the correct Pshat, meaning that the days of the week should not be given names like Sunday and Monday that are named for heavenly bodies. Not all of our names in English are named for heavenly bodies, but in the Romance languages, all of the names of the week are named for heavenly bodies. They're either named for heavenly bodies or for Roman gods and goddesses, but the the heavenly bodies were also Roman gods, and so Saturday, Saturn, so we're talking about the god Saturn, and we're talking about the planet Saturn. It's the same thing, and this is true that in any period of Jewish history, as far as I know, Jews have never had names for the days of the week. They're just the first day of Shabbat, the second day of Shabbat. In the old days, when I was still living in Canada and I had little children, and we came and we spent sabbatical years. We had the privilege of being able to come here to Israel a few times on sabbatical years. My children got extremely upset that there was school on Sunday, and they insisted that we were not allowed to refer. We of course spoke English at home, but they set out a rule that we were not allowed to refer to Sunday as Sunday, because Sunday means a fun day when you don't have any duties and you can do all sorts of things that you want to do. And so they insisted that we had to refer to Sunday as Yom Rishon, because they had lost this wonderful Sunday that they had back in Canada. Okay, so that's Ramban thinks that Zachor et Yom HaShabbat means that in the language that you use, you should be thinking of Shabbat in the names that you give to the days of the week, days of the week. And then he says, but the rabbis have a further Midrash, connecting Zachor to the word Lakadsho, commanding us to make Shabbat holy by mentioning it. Zachor, in modern Hebrew, we have a sharp distinction between zachar in the kal, which means to remember, and lehazkir in the hifil, which means to mention. It's not clear that that distinction is consistent in rabbinic literature and in biblical literature, and it is possible that the kal form of zachar meant to mention, and so at least the Mechilta here suggests in Midrash that mentioning Shabbat is a way of making it holy. Thus it is written in Mechilta, make it holy with a blessing. From this we learn that one makes kiddush over wine when Shabbat begins. This is Torah law. It is not an asmachta. Ramban really believes that there is a text that has a pshat level of meaning. The pshat level of meaning is keep track of the day of the week. And actually more than that, the pshat level is always name your days of the week in terms of Shabbat. The Midrash is also in the biblical text. The Midrashic level of meaning is in there, and it means that when you make Shabbat holy, when you accept Shabbat, when you begin Shabbat and say, okay, now I am starting Shabbat, you should say words that make it holy, and that's the Midrash says you should say these words over a glass of wine, make kiddush over wine when Shabbat begins. And this is Torah law. The Midrash is also Torah law. It's not just the Pshat that is Torah law. Torah law is also the Midrash. The Midrash says that's what you do when Shabbat begins. It's not an asmach, that's not a rabbinic law that they made up and they just artificially attached to the biblical text. Why does Ramban say it? Because he's read Ibn Ezra's commentary here. Ibn Ezra says, the meaning of Lakadsho is to give Shabbat a special status by not doing work, following the pattern of how God made Shabbat holy. But the rabbis thought to make it holy over wine is also valid. Of course, it's a good thing to make kiddush over a glass of wine, but it's an asmachta. That's why Ramban says there's no asmachta here. Ramban is defending the Midrash and saying the Midrash is really passing on some of the meaning of the biblical text, because Ibn Ezra said, nah, it's just an asmachta. And Ibn Ezra says it applies to any person who isn't a Nazarite. If you made a vow not to drink any wine, you don't have to make kiddush over a glass of wine. And who lives in a country where wine can be found. A person who lives in a country where there is no wine has transgressed no law, says Ibn Ezra. He says you can't say that the Torah said that you have to make kiddush over a glass of wine. Ibn Ezra, who lived in many, many countries during his life, probably lived at some point in places where wine was not available. At times when he was living in a strict Muslim country, wine might not have been available. And he says it's not saying that this Midrash has status as Torah law is not persuasive to Ibn Ezra, and his feeling is that this is something that's been added by the rabbis. It's very nice, and if you're in a place where wine is available, then you do this. Okay, and next week we will continue on this theme, and we will look more carefully at the difference between the two versions of the Shabbat commandment, the Shabbat commandment as it appears in Exodus, and the Shabbat commandment as it appears in Deuteronomy. And I'm going to open up the chat and take a look at that. But for anybody who's leaving, just let me wish you a Chag Sameach, a happy holiday next week for Shavuot, and we'll see you next week, and let's see what we can find in the chat.
We start with Epi, if you want to go up, right? That's the
Sure.
first question.
Yes.
God not only created the Shabbat on the seventh day, he also sanctified it. Here we are told that although we didn't create Shabbat, we can sanctify it. How can we lowly humans sanctify Shabbat if God already has done that? That's the mystical quality of our relationship to Shabbat. And I think this unique is a better translation of Kadosh than holy.
Right. Very good. I like that. It is, Epi, I agree. It is. It's interesting that God makes it holy, and that we're asked to make it holy also. Yes. Good. There's a private comment here. Let's see. Read the different interpretations. Aside from the pure intellect aspect, isn't this also like modern academics? You don't make a name for yourself by agreeing and confirming someone else, rather going on a different path. For sure, that coming up with a new interpretation is a way of being remembered, and that's why that it is very, very comparable to the way in which academics work. That if you just say that what the other academic said was right, then you don't advance in the field. Yes. Okay, Irene says Abraham Ibn Ezra is famous for his argument regarding Shavuot as not being the literal Shabbat, because the Karaites questioned this, of course, and took the Bible literally, which in Ibn Ezra's day had negative and community repercussions on the ground. If Shadal disliked Ibn Ezra, that is Shadal's problem. Okay, I agree, that is Shadal's problem. The question is how effective. I agree with you, Irene, certainly about Ibn Ezra's motivation, but the question is how effective the argument that he came up with in his commentary on this subject was. Yes.
You're doing okay. Otherwise, okay. Am Yisrael is commanded to be witness to 6 days of creation. Okay. Shabbat is there for our memory and commitment, is how I understand it. Zachor, we have to remember. I think that's what they're saying.
Uh-huh.
How Epi wants to know how Zachor is used in Yalav Yavo. Yalav Yavo v'Zacher Zichronenu Victornenu, right?
Yes. So again, so we were just talking about God making something holy and us making something holy, which are two very different things. But we also talk about us remembering things, but we also want God to remember us. The prayers on Rosh Hashanah certainly are focused on that, but that's also Ya'aleh v'yavo v'yagia v'yira'eh v'yiratzeh v'yishama v'yizacher zichronenu v'iktonenu. We're hoping that God will remember us. For those who are mystically inclined, this is very nice that we're talking about holiness coming from us and from God, and memory affecting us and affecting God.
Okay, Marty Crusoe wants to know what exactly a Karaite holiday would look like, since everything we do on the holidays is basically rabbinic legislation. Wants to know the liturgy of their davening, and in general, if they daven, 3 times a day, how often they daven, the concept of a minyan, etc.
The Karaite Siddur is almost entirely the Book of Psalms. They do have public reading from the Torah. One of my best friends here in Israel, Professor Daniel Lasker of Ben Gurion University of the Negev, has written a lot about Karaites, and he has another book coming out about Karaites soon, which I just read in manuscript. I recommend this book. It tells you a lot about their history and their practice. But he once told me a story. He said that occasionally, when the Karaite holiday doesn't fall out on the same day that our holiday falls on, that he would go to the Karaite synagogue to see how they would celebrate. Professor Lasker goes to a Rabbinite synagogue on a day that's one of our holidays, but he remembers one time he went to a Karaite synagogue on one of their holy days, and he said they had something like you can find in a bunch of Orthodox synagogues, where people are called up for some honor. I forget whether it's reading the Torah or something like that. They're called up for some kind of honor and are asked to pledge a certain amount of money to the synagogue for getting this honor. And he said that he felt like he was in some synagogue in small town America. Somebody gets up there and they ask him what he'd like to pledge, and he said 100 shekels, and he took out his wallet and started to take out 100 shekel note, and they said no, that they didn't want him paying the money on the holiday, so they had this rule about not that he didn't understand that he was just being asked to make a pledge and not to actually pay on this holy day. So there are many similarities to the way in which the Rabbinites celebrate holidays. But you're right, Marty. It's how do they, just based on the plain meaning of the biblical text, arrive at these things? I guess that if you're talking about the Karaites accept the holiness of all of the books of the Tanach, including the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where you see that on the Sabbath, they're not interested in commerce taking place in Jerusalem. They chase people away who are setting up their budkas to be selling things on Shabbat. So it is a good question. I'm not the world's expert at all on this, how this works.
Okay, and the last comment here is that the months and the years are based on nature. You look at the moon, you look at the sun, etc. You can figure out, but the days of the week are of course invented by man or by God, I guess. But there's no natural way to know how many days of the week, and there's no reason that the week has to be 7 days. we're we're very lucky. I can imagine if the non-Jewish world had an 8 or 9 day week, boy, would that mess up our life. But that's I don't think that's a question. I just think that's a comment. Okay.
And it's a very wise comment, and that's why people in most cultures had a certain consciousness of the cycle of the moon, because especially before there were electric lights, it was important to know when there's going to be a full moon, so that it's easier to do things outdoors. We saw that a number of weeks ago, even Ezra's Igeret HaShabbat, which was taking place in the middle of the night on a Friday night. He makes it clear that it was in the middle of the month, and that's why he was able to go outside into his backyard and read the book that had just come into his house. So people in all cultures had consciousness of this, and of course, people in all cultures have consciousness of the seasons of the solar year, because our life is greatly affected by whether it's February or May right now. But the days of the week, this is a pattern that is human made, and that's why that's one of the reasons they have to remember it, because there's nothing there in creation to remind you of it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Chag Sameach should be a Chag peace, simcha, and shalom. But please God, we look forward to seeing you next week. And of course, in 14 minutes, Lori Novick will be giving the last of her 4-part series on women and Kriyat HaTorah, talking today about the practical aspect of Kvod HaTzibur, i.e. partnership minyanim and the woman aliyot in practice. Look at the sources. So I invite everybody to stay. That's going to be in 13 minutes. This evening, Moshe Sokolov on the Haftarah of the week, and tomorrow Shuli Mishkin on her modern day Israel, finishing her series, and then our Parsha Shir 8:30 p.m. or 12:30 p.m. Friday in Australia, where Rabbi David Blackman, who will be giving the shir, will be. And then Friday morning, we go back in time at 9:30 in the morning. Please God, I'll be giving my Pirkei Avot shir. Sunday, Daniel Feldman and Rabbi Liebtag will both be speaking. Rabbi Liebtag his series on Mamad Har Sinai is over. He'll be giving a shir on Simchat Yantiv. That'll be this Sunday, is regular time, 11:15. Those who live in Israel will finish, 20 minutes before Yantiv starts. So it's good. Get prepared for Yantiv. What else will be? Shavuot's got to learn all night. The problem is that the night is so short. So right, especially on daylight saving time. So you got to start the learning before the night. So anyways, that's for those who live in America, they'll have a lot of time to learn then and prepare and eat cheesecake and learn some more. But anyways, we'll take a little bit of a break. Thank you again, Dr. Lockshin, and Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, and we'll start with Lori's class in about 12 minutes or so. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.